You can see this if you're watching on YouTube, and you will not be able to hear this or see this on the audio version. But we have a special guest who's joined us for this intro outro taping. Our new dog, Golda, is very loud and barks, so she is joining the recording. Say hello, Golda. Well, happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome back to the Realignment. As we said, hope you really enjoyed the episode we did with Kyla Scanlon. Got a lot of really great feedback, everything with the metaverse and Web3. Sagar, you saw a crazy amount of energy about that on Twitter. Do not worry, everyone. We're going to spend a lot more time in those spaces, going from the high level take we did with Kyla, going to more specific ones. There's a lot of exciting stuff coming down the pipeline. But for today's episode, we are back to more of our normal beat. We are speaking with Derek Robertson. He is a contributing editor at Politico Magazine based out in Michigan. And he's done a lot of really interesting writing lately that gets at a dilemma we've noticed in the show, which is that from the start, we said, hey, we don't do culture wars. We don't want to be a show that debates LGBTQ rights. We don't want to be a show that debates abortion. But increasingly, there's been a different set of culture issues that impact everything we're talking about here, impacted the race in Virginia, and we'd be remiss at covering. So, Sagar, give us a quick little read over of what those issues are, why Derek's writing, and frankly, stuff you've done on Breaking Points relates to it, and how this all comes together in a way that does not violate our commitment to make this not a boring debate zone about trodden over issues.
Yeah, look, this is fundamentally an analysis episode. This is an episode with Derek about the new style of conservatism, what I have called barstool conservatism and borrowed from Matthew Walther and others, and how it's going to rule our politics. And the essence is that the quote unquote culture wars of today just have nothing to do with the 90s. Like gay marriage, abortion, guns, those are static issues. They just don't drive the way that the new set of voters are moving towards Republicans. The ones of today, critical race theory, political correctness, gender ideology. These things are totally and completely different and very distinct from the culture war fights of the 90s. And there's no real constituency and lobbying group in Washington which is yet able to speak to them. So it's a very nascent phenomenon, but it's driving the results in Virginia. It's driving the results of being anti-lockdown, being anti-Fauci. If you want to understand like what modern social conservatism is, I think this is a good episode to try and help you wrap your head around. Because if you're looking at it from just 10 years ago, it wouldn't make any sense.
And here's the key thing, too. This isn't just about modern social conservatism. This is honestly about the moderate suburbs. Yeah. Everyone's still unpacking what happened in Virginia last week. But the key thing here is that there is increasing polarization and honest debate around education issues. And look, there's a quick note we have to say. It's frustrating we have to say this. We talk about CRT in this episode. Obviously, we are not literally alleging that people are reading Derek Bell and exact 1970s and 1980s academic theories in schools. But as our friend and great friend of the show, Ross Douthit, has pointed out, when people say CRT, they are referring to a broad set of ideologies and implications that may or may not be CRT. Obviously, Robin DiAngelo is not literally a descendant of Derek Bell. I'm sure Derek Bell would probably find Robin DiAngelo very cringe. Idiot, but the reality is, until we find a better, more precise word than CRT, we're going to use the word and phrase CRT to describe progressivism around race issues in school. So if you have beef with us using CRT and you want to comment and write in saying we're being unfair, please give us a better, more precise term that expresses the idea. I mean this totally seriously. I'm asking this in good faith because it's not productive to get caught up in this academic debate. We know what people are basically referring to. But speaking of things that people are referring to, once again, this is a book show. There's no book from Derek, at least not yet, but you can go follow the bookshop link to purchase any books, support the Realignment, support independent booksellers, and of course, the many authors we have on the show. 2, you can subscribe to the Realignment's Substack. It is available in the show notes as well, too. Finally, 3, we are supported by the Lincoln Network, not the Lincoln Project, which has covered itself in shame after the Virginia results and race. I seriously question the sanity of anyone who, regardless of your ideological perspective, continues to employ them as your actual campaign gurus at this point. My gosh. Lastly, hope you enjoy this episode. A lot of great stuff here. See you soon.
Let's get to it.
Derek Robertson, welcome to the Realignment.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm a big fan. I appreciate it.
Good to see you, Derek.
Yeah.
Derek, this is a show we've needed to do for a while because from the start, we said we weren't going to discuss culture war issues. By that, we basically meant abortion and most LGBTQA rights debates, etc. Pick how you want to frame that, depending where you are in the audience. However, it's become increasingly clear that whether it's the CRT debate, education in schools, the broader Barstool conservatives dynamic that Sagar's talked about on Breaking Points and you've written about in Politico, we have to address what we're basically going to today refer to as the new culture wars. So let's just start really broadly, then we can basically frame in how would you really delineate between those 1990s aughts culture war issues that we all grew up in and these emerging culture wars that you're spending a lot of time at Politico and are mostly and really internet driven. What's the delineating line here?
That's a great question. It's something I think about a lot. Being sort of I guess I wouldn't call myself like a young person anymore. I am in my early 30s, but a younger kind of internet native person. I start to think about how, I was in college or in the early, late 2000s, early 2010s, around the time when Tumblr was a really big thing. And something I started to see was cross-pollination of like the sort of academic theory-based classes that I was taking in college and these ideas spreading like wildfire through Tumblr, essentially. And it created this it was honestly like a very exciting time because I'm making a generalization here, but in the early Obama years, there was kind of a hazy sort of liberal rah-rah, let's go attitude in the hangover of the Bush years. Everybody was very excited about that. And there was this very strong kind of intellectual ferment, I think, in the early 2010s, especially with regard to like left academic theory. A lot of the ideas that are now, filtering down into public school curriculums like we're having debates about today. And I think that with that generation of college students, people generally roughly our age, moving into public policy spaces, moving into media, moving into politics, you see those ideas just kind of sprout and take hold. And I think that honestly, when I try to personally pinpoint a moment when I think these ideas really exploded into the mainstream, this isn't scientific, but for me, it really felt like the turn was around Ferguson. Just the conversation around race becomes so drastically different than it was during the Obama years. It was technically during the Obama years, but Obama was somebody who very aggressively tried to like downplay the salience of hardcore like racial analysis that became very much on vogue after Ferguson. And then you have it's like a pendulum swinging back and forth, gaining momentum where these ideas take hold. Then Trump comes along and he taps into this very deep-seated kind of like rage and indignation at those ideas, and each side becomes increasingly more intense, and that sort of creates the culture war foment that we have today.
You said something that the audience may have missed, but is actually semi-controversial in these more mainstream circles that we all swim around. You specifically referred to these academic ideas filtering into public schools, because in any conversation, especially post Virginia, you will hear people routinely say critical race theory is not in schools. X, Y, and Z theories are not in schools. So to what degree are you as a non-conservative? How would you assess the degree to which these, so A, what are these ideas? And B, how are they not moving into institutions like public schools?
Yeah, by now, I think during the Virginia gubernatorial election that we just sat through months and months of takes on, some good, some bad. I feel like not everybody, people who are probably listening to this podcast have a pretty good idea of what critical race theory is in a literal sense, because it was pedantically explained by everybody who supported Terry McAuliffe and was trying to sort of reduce these ideas in a way that underplays the extent to which they are influential. And this is something I was, when I got my own take in on election night this week, something that I tried to point out, and that I think Ross Douthat also got it very well in his column that he wrote after the election, is that, you know, it is in fact false that, you know, your fourth grader is going into class and having an hour a day between their grammar and their math lesson where it's like, okay, now it's CRT time. Everybody open up your like Derek Bell textbook and we're going to learn about that today. Like, that does not happen. But what does happen, and I think that liberals who support this should accept it and explain it thoroughly and advocate for it if they think it is a good thing, which many of them do, is that those ideas are incredibly influential in the world, you know, the professional class world that creates public school curriculums, you know, in the education world, in the diversity and equity inclusion consultant world, which almost every, you know, I won't say almost every, I'll say in the school districts that are wealthy and liberal and tend to make news, almost every one of those school districts has a DEI consultant, probably some kind of staff. And it's just, just as it's disingenuous to say, you know, it's kindergarten CRT story hour, it's also disingenuous to say that these ideas don't have any influence in schools, because they surely do. And they take the form of, you know, just different, I feel like you see a case, you know, every week where some activist seizes on something particularly outrageous to maybe a right of center American that's happening in like a San Francisco school district. And it's an assignment. And then we have a week-long debate over whether this is the totality of American education. It's a very complicated process that gets kind of, you know, I understand why you guys are hesitant to address culture war issues, because it's really hard to do it in a non-reductive way.
It's more that it's not even about, it's about that it becomes embroiled in a set of preconceived notions and is not a conversation which lends itself to nuance for most people. Because, as you said, they're like, what are you talking about, Derek? There was this one time that kids in San Francisco had to sort themselves by this color of their skin. And by the way, like, that is bullshit and it's terrible. But, you know, like, I'm not stupid, and I don't think that that's happening where I grew up in like College Station, Texas. That being said, my mom is a professor of education. I know what the ideas are in terms of what are being promulgated in terms of the new generation of teachers. And a lot of them have had to sit through exactly these DEI trainings. And so whenever BLM is happening nationally and the kids in school are like, hey, what's going on? What type of stuff do you think that they're going to hear? Or in the, you know, segments whenever they have to talk about slavery or the Civil War, it is very obvious that the discussion in the classroom today is not the same as 1992. Now, maybe it shouldn't be, as you said. That's fine. Let's have a discussion. I actually think it should be taught a lot better. But I want to get to the key of something that you said, which is that, look, it's obviously real. People feel it in the backlash and in terms of their advocacy. How does that change our politics? Because you were one of the only people who really identified the modern conservative strain, which for a variety of reasons, nobody in DC really wants to acknowledge. And what I mean by that is barstool conservatism, in that there is a libertarian ethos and backlash against political correctness, which is at the very heart of Trumpism, which is very inconvenient for evangelicals and Catholics who see themselves as the guardians of the socially conservative movement, and also very inconvenient for the socially liberal, fiscally conservative crowd that populates Washington. How and when did you kind of get your mind around the heart of this new culture war? Like, what events led you to kind of understand what politics was about today?
And Derek, quick thing, define barstool conservatism.
It's another good
define barstool conservatism and then get to Sagar's question there.
Yeah, I'll do that first. So I wrote a piece back in June called How Republicans Became the Barstool Party in Politico Magazine. And basically my premise was that there is an attitudinal strain that is kind of at the vanguard of Republican politics today. That is, I hesitate almost to even describe it as reactionary, because that carries its own set of connotations, but it is literally a reaction to changing social norms. everything that we're talking about right now with regard to like mainstream institutional, sort of liberal institutions becoming far more progressive, it is a reaction to that. People become, and most of them, there's a large strain of white reaction here, but not everybody who would describe themselves as a barstool conservative is white, to be sure. And I think there are plenty of examples of these kind of politics resonating with non-white people that Democrats would do well to take notice of. But people simply, there's a deep strain of kind of I'll call it like psychological libertarianism in American culture. People simply don't like being told how to think. And they really don't like being told that they are racist for the way that they think. Even, if in some cases it's, they are trafficking in racial grievance or, saying something just outright offensive. So that reaction is the core of what the barstool conservative is. The barstool conservative is not an evangelical, is not a Catholic.
And they're not libertarian either. There's a key thing there.
Yeah, they're I don't think many of the barstool conservatives are like reading Murray Rothbard. Sorry, that was petty. Matthew Walther, who's a writer I really admire, a fellow Michigander who writes for he wrote in the American Conservative a piece that preceded mine and sort of started to turn to your question, Sagar. This started turning the wheels on my thinking about how the impact that barstool conservatism has on the Republican Party. He is he is a socially conservative Catholic, and he's a very clear-eyed observer of what's happening in conservative politics. And he basically wrote this essay that was saying, Donald Trump came along and he has, made many political sops to evangelicals and social conservatives because it was electorally advantageous to him. But he is not one of them. He will never be one of them. And his base is not really those voters. His base is people, sort of a broad coalition of people who don't like the liberal consensus. His entire political project is a reaction to the liberal consensus. And that's why he was so easily co-opted as president by just kind of standard Republican politics, because you can't really legislate reaction to the liberal consensus. Although there are lots of people doing interesting things to sort of work through that space, some of whom you've had on this podcast. Ultimately, and I think Trump is a big part of it. People get tired of talking about Trump, and for good reason, but he was a perfect conduit for this reaction to kind of an ascendant liberal ideology and culture.
Could you speak to something Sagar and I discussed on Breaking Points? I do not understand why the center-left Terry McAuliffe crew has such a hard time addressing the broader CRT conservative critique. I don't understand why the word white supremacy has to come in. I don't understand why some weird random hyper-conservative parent saying that Toni Morrison is scary. That obviously happens. That's always happened. We all remember when Harry Potter was banned from schools in certain southern states. This has always happened. I don't get why Democrats can't, and I'd love to hear what your theory as to why this is such an issue. Why can't Democrats just say, hey, we get it. There are some crazy things happening right now that none of us actually believe in. We think America has a complicated history of race. We're going to teach that history, but do not worry. We will never endorse any ideas that are actually dangerous. Like, that's a very straightforward answer. It's directionally true for how they actually feel. It's so fascinating. And I wonder how this is for you. Whenever we talk to a lot of center-left people on the podcast, like off the record, they'll be like, oh yeah, like Robin DiAngelo's crazy. Whoa, Ibram Kendi, I definitely wouldn't put him in charge of the Department of Education. They will literally say this. So I don't understand when it comes to public performance, why it is just not so difficult to give a pretty center left, oh yeah, we get why parents are scared of these crazy things. Don't worry, we're not doing those things. But we also, like you, don't want to have racist children. So I just deal with my frustration. This is a therapy session, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, as a center-left liberal myself, this is something that I think I may have at one point literally talked about in therapy. So yes, let's do that.
It's getting a little soft boy here. We need to be careful. We'll get to that in a bit there too.
That's another episode. Another one of my Politico Mag pieces I'll direct people to. So to answer your question, I will say this with the caveat that like I am a sort of more of a cultural critic and observer. I haven't reported on this. I know there are lots of people who are embedded in this world who I'm friends with, and probably have more like fact-based, informational takes on this that are very interesting, and they're out there. I would, if I had to venture a guess, just based on living in the space, being in liberal world, I think that it's a combination of two things. One of those things is that the donor and activist class is far, 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 far more liberal and progressive than the average actual like liberal voter, the median Democratic voter, let's say. And you don't want those people mad at you because they're powerful and influential in politics, just as social conservatives and evangelicals are powerful, in sort of backroom Republican politics. The uber progressive donor and activist groups are very powerful in Democratic politics. That's just reality. They do, Liberty University, that crew is far to the right of American politics, yet they have significant sway in the Republican Party. These people are far to the left of the Democratic Party in American politics, and they have serious sway in the Democratic Party, because that's just how politics works. So I think that's a huge part of it. Another part of it is honestly that it is still kind of like a Trump hangover thing. This is something I saw. You mentioned McAuliffe at the beginning of this. McAuliffe is not like Cory Bush. Like, he's a boring, like, liberal white guy who's been
literal Clinton Democrat.
Like,
literal
literally
Clinton
a financier.
Exactly.
His entire career was raising money from rich people.
He's like blue. He's like a donkey blue shirt Mitt Romney, basically. Like, and yet it's impossible for him to let this go, because I think that probably some people in like the Democratic consulting class mislearned the lessons of the Trump era, where they think that you can paint somebody like Glenn Youngkin as like Trump, which is just like absurd.
Not true. It's just not true.
It's untrue. It's also insulting to voters' intelligence. Like, clearly there are many people in Virginia who were Biden Youngkin voters, and like they weren't fooled by this message. But it's like Trump's style was so singular that he was able to unite this very unlikely coalition that gave you the 2018 blue wave, and that turned Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin blue in 2020. And Trump's sui generis, like that's the one thing we can all agree on. And I think that Democrats have this hangover where, people will see the Republican brand and think Glenn Youngkin is a scary racist, but people aren't that simple. Like, people are, voters can be weird and unpredictable, but they're like a little more sophisticated than I think a lot of people are aware of or would like to believe.
Yeah, and it's very true. I think you should just trust people, and you can make a case. It is funny. I heard some retconning of Virginia. They're like, why didn't Terry McAuliffe criticize Glenn Youngkin for being Carlyle Group CEO? And it was because he was also an investor in the Carlyle Group, which I find just incredible.
Another
in terms of, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Glenn Youngkin was also like advocating for teachers to get a pay raise. Like, these are not stock Republican or reactionary politics. I mean, Glenn Youngkin is conservative, and yes, he played up the real anxieties that parents had, some of which were rooted in discomfort with talking about race. But it's nowhere near a Trump campaign. It's just, like I said before, I will say it again. I think it is insulting to voters' intelligence to pretend that it's something other than what it is.
Yeah. So where do you think it goes from here, Derek? Because it's interesting in terms of the Republican side, and also teacher pay. That was something that was, I think it was paved by DeSantis. I did an entire monologue right before the pandemic back in February. DeSantis was going on this whole tear about creating the highest, salary for teachers in the entire country. It was one of the single most popular things that he did in the state of Florida, along with like Everglades protection. So, pre-pandemic, there was like there was a lot of stuff going on there. And I've been thinking recently that there's a reversion to the mean happening here. And so in the future of our politics, kind of what do you see the 2022 election here to be about? Because the Republicans have learned something very simple. All we have to do is be directionally more to the center of the median American voter than the Democrats are on critical race theory, lockdowns, closing schools, the economy, inflation, all of these things. And we're just going to win. Even though, like, look, let's be honest, like, not a single one of those things is going to be solved under a Republican House or even under a president, as we saw under Donald J. Trump as president. And yet, we still have not seen like a liberal consensus, as Marshall is saying, as, hey, like, this was real. I mean, even if you saw Biden in his response to the Virginia results, Derek, he was like, oh, well, basically insinuated if we'd passed the bill, it might have helped. Like, look, honestly, they could have given everybody like $6,000 and Virginia probably still would have gone red. And I just don't think that they've been able to process what exactly has happened here. So where do you think that this will play out both in 2022, but also in 2024? And then for the 2024 one, include a Trump version and then a non-Trump version.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really interesting question. This is something I've thought about a lot because I think what you said about sending out more checks was very trenchant, because something my Politico Magazine colleague, Michael Grunwald, said on Twitter after the Virginia election, which I thought was very unfortunate, but very true, which is that there's not a lot of evidence from recent elections that concrete policy changes have a lot of effect on how voters vote. Right. Voters vote on their gut feeling. They vote on their cultural analysis, which or
gas prices.
Yeah.
Guys, the president has got nothing to do with gas. I don't know how many times I have to say it.
Right. I think literally every time I've seen like a "Let's Go Brandon" post in the wild, it had something to do with gas prices. Like people see the world around them and they kind of react with their gut. And well, as a cultural critic, I guess that means I'll never be out of work, which kind of like makes me feel morally conflicted.
Incentives.
But, yeah. I think that what you're going to see. So your first part of the question was about Democrats in 22 and then 24 with Trump and non-Trump. Let's start with 22. I think that the worst is yet to come for Democrats. That's just my pundit's take. And the reason that I think that is because I think that this, yes, people overmap from one race. There are thermostatic trends in elections, but I think Pandora's box has kind of been opened. And I think a lot of liberals who are uncomfortable with tying their party entirely to basically DEI consultant worldview are going to have their concerns taken more seriously. And that's going to set off Dems in disarray times 5,000, because you just thinking about it from a cultural and rhetorical avenue, once you've staked your entire political philosophy on the idea that anyone who opposes this ideology is a crypto racist, you can't back off that. It's hard to Mott and Bailey that idea. Because it is so it's so black and white. You've kind of you don't have a lot of moves left after you've tied your whole political argument to that, as Terry McAuliffe did in Virginia. Yeah. And I think there's going to be a huge blow up on that. And I think that maybe cooler heads will prevail and the economy will recover, and you'll have Democrats say let's deal with this after 22 and let's just hold hands now and try to run on the economy. But I think that's going to be a really tough sell. I read the Wall Street Journal a lot, but I will not even dare to venture to guess how the economy is going to go or make a prediction about that here. I just think it's going to be a tough sell because, we were talking about, culture war stuff moves voters. They react to the world around them. Yeah. In 2024, I think I probably have a little bit more of a simple view on this than a lot of other liberal critics do. I think that if Trump runs, I think he will win the nomination. And I think that he is such a singular figure that it will be not easy, but eminently possible to beat him again. I mean, if you have a fairly stable economy and you run the 20 campaign again, you say like, do you guys really want to go back to this? Like, remember 2018 when everything was like this? Do you want that again? I think that's like a tough cultural sell for a lot of people. And I think that gives you a good chance of putting back together that coalition that elected Biden, as frayed as it might be right now. And it is frayed. Virginia is a perfect example of that. Without Trump, I think it's a lot easier for, and, the people, my friends on the right who are, like farther to the right of, say, like a Ross Douthat, who I cited earlier, will say, you're just saying this because you're a liberal and you're manifesting the dream you want to see in the world or whatever. But I think that a less actively inflammatory Republican than Trump could easily win along those lines that you described, Sagar, making that argument that you made. And the real question is whether that candidate can win a primary, but that's a question for somebody who knows the internal Republican Party politics a lot better than I do.
Something I'm fascinated by is how different groups are responding to the Virginia dynamics I just described. So Sagar and I just did Breaking Points on Thursday the 4th, obviously, and something you saw from a lot of progressive Dems is they tried to make Virginia all about Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, and if we passed this big bill, it would have made a huge difference. But if you actually take a step back and think about it, Sagar, we made this point, it's a 10-year spending bill. So it's not as if passing the bill, I don't see any world where you got the most perfect progressive version of this bill ever. It would have had any actual impact on the election itself. Therefore, the dynamics of that race probably didn't come down to a specific economic progressive package. How do you see the progressive squad responding to these DEI dynamics? Because what's so fascinating about progressives, no, not even progressives, like the Democratic Socialist left is half of them are radical Marxists who hate identity politics. But the other half, and I would probably put AOC in this category, she's definitely woke, but she puts the economic stuff in front of her. Bernie's operationally in the same category. They seem to be in a place where they don't really know what to do in this scenario. If you're Bhaskar Sunkara, you say, of course the crazy radical woke stuff didn't work. Economics is primacy.
Right.
We don't believe that to be the fact here. But if you're AOC and Bernie, how do you respond to what just happened? Also in New Jersey too. This isn't just a specifically Virginia dynamic.
Yeah, I think progressives are kind of like stuck in the torture chamber with this because, especially, like the Bhaskar Sunkaras of the world. And I find this writing really enjoyable and read it quite frequently, but like you can't divorce, in terms of mass American politics, you can't divorce, and I like hate when people use this term, but like I will just use it as shorthand right now, but you can't divorce like quote wokeism from like the broader progressive economic project. Because they appeal to the same, and this is where I'm very sympathetic to both of these things. To the average person who's not, like a super hardcore, like an ideological person or a politics nerd who's reading Jacobin or who's like who has like a hammer and sickle in their Twitter handle or whatever. Like the average, what else? I'll call them the normie progressive because I know many of these people. The normie progressive reacts the same way to arguments for economic fairness that they do to like wokeism.
What do you mean by that? Can you explain that?
Because I think they both appeal to just kind of these fundamentally, just as I was talking about how the Barstool Republican kind of represents this inchoate American desire to not be told what to do. Like the constituent parts of like the AOC Bernie wing of the Democratic Party both appeal to this other very strong American ideal as represented probably best by the New Deal era, that this should be a fairer country. It should be a fairer country for everybody. And that there are groups in this country who have been historically marginalized and that require special amelioration through policy or, through the way we think or through the way we order our institutions. And I think that if you are the kind of person who like reads Jacobin, it's really easy to split hairs and say like identity politics is toxic and we need to jettison it from our movement. But you're going to have a really hard time getting a lot of people not maybe a lot, but like as many people on board with your project if you do that. I don't think
you're already, and to make the point, and you're already struggling to get people on board your project too. That's the other dynamic here too.
Right. They need those people. They don't have a movement without that ideology, I don't think. You saw the past 5 years in progressive politics, like there's been this repeated mantra that if you're just as bold as possible and you just don't compromise and you advocate for Medicare for all and not just economic, policies, but like, prison abolition or like the Israeli boycott or something like that, that you will inspire people with your radicalism, people to come out of the forest and like join you like Lord of the Rings or something. And like they do that and those people don't come. You have to work with like the electorate and the voters that you have. And I think that to build, you don't get the Bernie Sanders movement to the size that it is if it's just a kind of like, if you it's like that Twitter joke about turning the big dial that says like the Twitter thing is about racism. This is not about racism, but it's like if you turn down the economic style and turn up like the social justice politics style, you get the Elizabeth Warren campaign, which went nowhere.
Yes, right.
And if you turn down the social justice style and turn up the economic style, nobody's really done that. And I don't think that in the Democratic Party, that's really a viable project as the Democratic Party as it's constituted today, at least.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting and important point. I made it many times during the 2020 campaign. And I think Bernie's failure and then ultimate, kind of acquiescence to a lot of this just really proved that point. And same in terms of the actual salience of what a lot of these progressives thought that they had in terms of power in the Democratic Party. And it turns out that they're like probably the weakest constituent link within the entire thing. Something they really haven't grappled with, right?
Yeah, I mean, when it was I feel like a shill right now. I keep shouting out my Politico pals, but my colleague Ruari Arietta Kenna wrote a piece today that published today about the Sunrise Movement. It's kind of like a wither the Sunrise Movement. What role do they have in this world where Joe Manchin can just kind of like put his hand out and keep them at bay like Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo. Yeah. And Manchin says in it.
And who are they? And who is this? We actually haven't talked about the Sunrise Movement before. Who are they?
The Sunrise Movement are kind of like a great example of what we're talking about. They are an environmental activist nonprofit or organizing group. They're super youth oriented. They started out as like this really hardcore, uncompromising group that advocated for much stronger policies to fight climate change. And they experienced the mission creep that many of these such progressive groups have, where it eventually grew to encompass like the Israel-Palestine conflict and prison abolition and all these other things. Matt Iglesias wrote a great piece about this in his newsletter earlier this year, if I remember correctly. And they find themselves in a position now where Joe Manchin is quoted in this piece as responding to their demands for the current infrastructure bill by just saying, elect more liberals. And he's right. Like that's you, like you're in a really tricky position if you just hand wave, if your demands can be hand waved away by one senator who controls the fate of the balance of power. And that brings us back to our core point that we're talking about here, which is that I don't think it's possible in a in a country with the level of polarization that we have and the kind of weird idiosyncratic institutions that we have to elect more liberals without being more honest and more self-reflective about the position Democrats find themselves in culturally.
I want to speak to something that came to mind. It's a theme I've been increasingly interested based on just what you're saying, which is as a result of, let's just say, center-left progressive people obviously controlling, this isn't a conspiracy theory, but just controlling entertainment, cultural inputs, government at the, in the small g sense, the technology industry, et cetera, you've really seen the muscles of just politics, like small p politics, just decline. So, and you see this across the folks who we're talking about here. It's funny. A lot of people are tweeting things like progressives, you're super ticked off that the spending bill isn't as big as you want it to be. This is a terrible bill. Walk. Let the bill fail. And I'm like, hey, you realize that Kirsten Sinema would probably like that if it happened. Joe Manchin would probably like that if it happened. Like at a political level, you can't offer them anything. Like they support something happening, but they don't care that much. If you're seeing the move to go straight to white supremacy without actually making a plan, it's actually incredible. You're seeing CNN panels where they're talking about white supremacy. They're saying we need to talk more about January 6th, not to underplay January 6th, but at a pure political level. These plans obviously aren't going to end anywhere productive unless you just have Trump, because like you said, Trump, for a great many voters, is just so odious that you basically don't have to worry. Trump will give you the ammunition you need to get, you need to really handle here. So my question is, how do you see the rising stars, younger folks in the Democratic Party just trying to think through these dynamics? Because I don't think they have anything to say to Barstool conservatives. I don't think they have anything to say to any of these groups unless Trump is making the case for them with his various degrees of terribleness.
I think that's correct. Honestly, I'm kind of hard up to think of an example of this. Honestly, and people will probably like reflexively be surprised that this is my answer. But I think somebody who is kind of trying this, and he'll get pulled in a million different directions, and we'll see how it goes. But I almost think that Pete Buttigieg is trying to do this a little bit.
Yeah. No, right.
He presents, I think I'm not saying this in a capacity as a reporter, nobody clip this.
Nobody clip this. A million clip.
You shouldn't have said it. You should have just said it.
Yeah, I'm going to get clipped on a certain conservative podcast. But I think that you see him kind of subtly maneuvering as a foil to Kamala Harris, as somebody who is a little bit more relatable to the quote unquote average American. And I think it's honestly, people will say there is a racial dynamic here that is very complicated. But honestly, I think a lot of it, and this is because I just spent a year of my life and my career there, I think a lot of this has to do with his being from Indiana. Pete Buttigieg is the child of academics and grew up in an incredibly cosseted and intellectual environment, but he also grew up in Indiana, and Indiana's a really particular kind of place. It's a state that votes reliably red, that had a Democratic senator well into the Trump era. It's kind of people there don't really they're not as activated by hardcore culture war politics, either from the right or from the left, as, a Donald Trump or Kamala Harris would run on in their own individual ways. And I think he's somebody who kind of understands that and tries to thread the needle in saying, hey, I'm a progressive. I believe in progressive causes. I think we should have a fairer country, but I'm not going to press so hard. It's the Obama playbook. People act like there's some great mystery as to how you can do this as a Democrat. The most popular Democratic president, I don't know, maybe Clinton was pretty popular. People tend to forget that, but a very popular Democratic president ran.
But he did the same thing.
Well,
right.
Well, and the quick thing on this is Clinton did not have the negative headwinds that Obama did. So Obama's performing in a different political context than Clinton was.
Right. Yeah. Totally. That is completely accurate. They both ran a really similar playbook. And I think that I jokingly tweeted out the other day, Al Gore's campaign announcement speech from 1999. I was like, hey, if there's any Democrat disappointed after this race, here, this is free for you to use and adapt. It's pretty.
It's from Tennessee.
Yeah, right.
It was. I tell people this all the time. I'm like, you guys know the Democrats had a 60-seat majority in a decade ago?
Yes.
Arkansas, Tennessee. There were a lot of Dems.
Yep.
Well, quick thing, and this is where it gets complicated. A lot of the people who were kind of subtweeting, we're tweeting at them at this point, they do not want that. They do not want the version of the Democratic Party that was 60-something votes. The same people who are just everything's corrupt, the DNC is stealing everything. Let's just say you would be incredibly disappointed in a Democratic Party that had a 60-seat Senate majority. If you, because that's what's so funny. This is why these people don't know how to handle Joe Manchin. They don't understand that real talk. Like, I hate when people are like, "Oh, Joe Manchin's just bought off." I'm like, Joe Manchin would perform probably the same exact moves he's making, plus or minus one, to remain elected in the state of West Virginia. Like, which is, what's the Occam's razor? Which is more likely?
Right.
A hyper conservative, super red state elects a Democrat. It's probably because the Democrat, aside from his frankly biographical attachment to the Democratic Party, is going to mostly be a moderate Republican. This is just, This is politics. This isn't a conspiracy. It's obviously true. And frankly, if you're a Democrat, you should be grateful he caucuses with you so that you actually could contain a Senate majority.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm thinking, it's like, you want to know what a 60 seats looks like? Blanche Lincoln. Nobody talks about Blanche Lincoln. Or who's that governor in Alabama, the pro-life one? John Bell Edwards, right? It's like,
Louisiana,
or it's Louisiana. Like, there's a Democratic governor. He actually won re-election in a culture war referendum. Oh, but he's just pro-life. Like, that's that's the truth.
A Democratic governor won a race in Kentucky, just within the past couple of years. So
that's exactly right. We covered that a lot on Rising, and it was the same. It was completely overlooked by a lot of people in the press. And actually, that one was a little bit more of a populist one, if I recall. That was on like Medicare expansion and stuff like that. But anyway, fascinating political wins. Marshall's computer is dying. So last question here, Derek, which is that in terms of, you are a very good cultural critic, a good cultural observer, what do you see the next backlash as manifesting in politics, or are we just going to be living in the current one that we're already seeing?
That's a really good question. Maybe this is just kind of like the narcissism of being within center left liberal world, but I do kind of see. Let me think about this for a second, because I do think that the trends at play in the Virginia governor's race that we just saw are I think that's just kind of starting. And I think Republicans are going to be campaigning on that for the next however many years until Democrats change their stripes. In addition to that, I think that you will start to see a little bit more oxygen, and maybe I'm just projecting here, a little more oxygen for people who are not as kind of Pharisee-like about cultural politics within the Democratic Party, kind of standing up and stretching a little bit more. I don't know in terms of a popular backlash what form that will take, because this is, I was just listening to Barry Weiss's interview with Robbie, excuse me, I don't know why I said that, Rob Anderson, where he was talking about the idea of luxury beliefs and cultural backlash, where, I think it was Barry who was talking about how she had a friend who says that this is actually these trends are somewhat predictable. And this idea appeals to me as a cultural critic. It's what he thinks about pop culture a lot, where what's cool now is not going to be cool in 4 years, because what's cool is based on what a vast majority of people believe. So I do I wonder if there will be some kind of cultural backlash to the like overweening like uber progressive domination of like cultural output and its representations. And I don't think that necessarily takes the form of Trumpism either. I think that, I think you might see something more like, I wrote in like the cultural climate of like the late 90s and early 2000s, which was like toxic and weird in a lot of different ways, but also had a lot of I don't think like South Park exists, like if Matt Stone and Trey Parker are 25 years younger than they are. It just doesn't exist. And I think you might start to see people pushing for more of a cultural climate like that.
I think you're 100% right. It's fascinating. I kind of look for the same stuff. I've recently gotten really into lifting weights. And what I really discovered is bro lift culture is become super right wing. And I'm like, what happened? Like all of a sudden, all my favorite guys who are really into lifting weights are like anti-vaccine mandate. They're like, bros, we got to take care of our health. They're like, bros, they're like, stay away from all this like nonsense out in the politics, like get out in the sun. It's very culturally counter. And yet at the same time, Derek, these people are not pro-life. They're like, don't give a shit about gay marriage. They probably all smoke weed or they're like fine with smoking weed. But then they're like posting memes about Dr. Fauci.
Right.
And I'm like, something's happening here, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure exactly what that is, but personally, I would bet on that. And I do think Barstool conservatism is probably the best encapsulation of all of that. So anyways, man, really appreciate you joining us. You're going to have to come back. We'll do a much longer episode too after the next election. One of my personal favorite, authors in the mainstream media. So thank you very much for joining us, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sagar. Thank you, Marshall. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.